Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. So both of your parents, as I understand it, never worked for a salary. They were kind of worked for a commission.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been, from what I've read, like a kind of culture in your family that you've got to go out there and hustle and kind of make your money by hustling.
Yeah.
Is that right? And do you think that is a big part of why you became an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think it is right. My parents weren't like, wow, you should be an entrepreneur. We really think you should start a business. And neither of my parents necessarily started businesses. You know, my mom sold homes for a builder and my dad did loans and worked with like new home developers and stuff like that. But they never worked for a salary. And, you know, there were ups and downs financially in my family. My dad's dad owned a motel that he grew up on with like 7 of the kids. So he comes from a really, I don't know, kind of like you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of environment, even though he never, quote unquote, bootstrapped a business. And I think, for me, I never really belonged, I guess. There was no career path that I was really drawn to. Nobody really explained to me what a career was. And that was definitely a disadvantage when I started employing people because I had no idea what they needed to be successful. And just kind of landed in entrepreneurship very much accidentally, trying to avoid working for other people or working, period. And then I became a CEO, and the rest is history that I guess we'll talk about. So
it's interesting that does seem to be a common pattern amongst very successful entrepreneurs like you, of school years just really grating against the idea of these rules which seem so arbitrary, often applied by people who you may not feel should be in charge of you.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward a little bit to your later teenage years, early 20s. Reading up on you, it sounds like you had all sorts of wild adventures and got yourself into all sorts of scrapes. Tell us about them. Tell us about the fun as a late teenage year person, and what lessons you learned from all of that.
Totally. I mean, I hated high school. And so I homeschooled in the later years of high school and actually moved out when I was 17 before I got my diploma, moved into a closet for $60 a month.
Closet? A real closet?
Yeah. Yes, like under some stairs. Like you couldn't stand up in it. But
Wow.
I put like a sleeping bag down and I got like a carpet remnant and cut it to fit. I think actually it like, did this. It wasn't like perfectly cut.
You literally slept in a closet?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I was, I didn't really want things. It wasn't until I guess I could afford things that I wanted things or had any taste level, or I'm not really sure. But that's where I, went at the end of high school. My parents had divorced when I was 17 and my mom moved to Oakland and my dad was like figuring it out in our family home, and it's just not a happy place. So I did that, and then I moved to Olympia, Washington. I was still angsty, very much like an anti-capitalist. In high school, I went to the anarchist book fair in San Francisco every year.
Why were you anti-capitalist?
Because I just didn't want to be a quote unquote wage slave. I didn't want to spend I thought that work was, submitting to the 9 to 5 and then having these like whiffs of freedom, between, on weekends, and that you spend most of your life working. I've spent most of my life working now, which wasn't my goal, but I've aligned, naturally kind of like aligned the things that I'm curious about, and it got me very far because I was interested in them. And, there's times it felt like work and times it didn't feel like work. So I moved to Olympia, Washington, did a bunch of like goofy hitchhiking, up and down the West Coast in like big rigs. So those huge trucks, and, had a lot of fun. But at a certain point I felt like, I'm going to age out of this. I was just like, I got caught stealing actually.
No way.
Yeah. And so that was when I was like, I was like, I want to be in control of my life. And if I'm doing things that break the law, I'm actually doing the opposite of what I want. So it wasn't like, I'm going to go play the game now. But it was just like, I'm going to go get a solid job at a photo lab and then a record store and then a shoe store. I didn't know there were careers beyond like retail. And I thought that people worked in business were like corporate slaves and squares, and they all carried briefcases and just like, And that's just like a very simplistic view, but I had never, seen what it's like to really be in a workplace. And then I was 22 and again, still like working these goofy hourly jobs. And my last job was in the lobby of an art school, checking student IDs. And so the job was just sitting there. And if someone walked in, I'd say like, hey, can you sign in? Can I see your ID? And I'd be like, admissions is on the second floor. And that was it. That was
That was the
the
job.
entirety of the job. But I had a computer and I was on MySpace at the time. And I started getting friend requests from eBay sellers who were selling vintage and using MySpace and, had a profile and, each week like announced like new listings, you could publish that kind of stuff on MySpace and, went and clicked through. I wore entirely vintage at the time. I just liked it more for whatever reason. My jacket's vintage, and
That you bought offline or online?
back then I bought it all offline. There wasn't a ton of online shopping. There was eBay, the marketplace, and then there weren't a lot of like small businesses opening, e-com shops selling vintage or clothes. It was very much like big retailers, eBay, Etsy didn't exist. So this is in 2006 and was like, oh wow, these auctions are going crazy. It wasn't like, place an offer kind of eBay bid. I don't even know if that was there at the time. It was auctions only, and they would start the prices at $9.99, which seemed, I mean, I could buy things for less than that.
Okay.
But, a girl in Copenhagen, a girl in Australia, maybe the dollar's strong in, some European country, and for them it's a lot cheaper to buy it from the US, and the auctions just like went crazy and the prices I saw were like way beyond what I had ever seen vintage go for. And I was like, cool. I had like the Dome, iMac
Yes.
and, got some vintage together and like created my account and named it Nasty Gal Vintage and put my first listings up, and they didn't sell right away. It took me a while to learn what people wanted. And that's like a whole nother story. But
And you're doing this from the job where you're checking people's ID and you're like sitting there on the side selling the stuff on eBay?
no, I actually quit I got that job because I needed health insurance.
Okay.
And in the US at the time, if you had a pre-existing condition, I had a hernia, you couldn't get individual health insurance. The only way to get it would be group health insurance. And so I got the job at this like pretty corporate art school in San Francisco, and had to wait 3 months for my insurance benefits to kick in. Got my hernia fixed, got my surgery done, and paid $50 to Kaiser or something, and then was like, I don't know what's next, and was kind of bouncing, like living with my boyfriend at the time, and then was like, let me see if I can make a few bucks on eBay so I don't have to work for other people. And that was it. I was just trying to evade work.
How quickly did it start to really work?
I mean, I'd say I learned a lot just watching other sellers. I didn't do exactly what they did, but it's not hard to reverse engineer something as simple as selling things on eBay and seeing what works and what people are bidding on. So I'd say like probably a few months before I started, wasn't exploding yet, but I was like, okay, this is solid. And, my customers came back, and, I'd see the same name and, address of someone who had won an auction, and, started growing my MySpace audience for Nasty Gal Vintage. And this was, before Facebook ads and, what they've built, their entire business on. But I had this bot this like illegal bot that I downloaded somewhere. And at the time, like, you could scrape people's MySpace profiles. They were, all of that data was just whatever, like HTML on the web. It wasn't like something like Instagram. And I would type in their user ID number on this bot, and like say it's like a magazine, like a cool fashion magazine that I know my customers followed. I could type that user ID in and then even drill down as far as ages, countries, like, and then who they who they were friends with. And so I was able to do like really targeted marketing, and the thing would sit there and add friends. And every like 10 or so, I would have to sit there and enter a CAPTCHA code to prove I was human. And then it would add like another 10 friends. And I would just sit there for hours having this bot add really qualified people on MySpace. And I don't know if I had like 30,000 or 60,000 friends or whatever they were called on MySpace by the time I left. But MySpace was a really big engine for Nasty Gal.
And that kind of approach to growth hacking presumably was something that no one else running an eBay store was doing.
Probably not.
And how do you reckon you were someone who figured that out? What was it about you that did something like that? But then also the brand that you created was just kind of like fire compared to a lot of, because the rest of the sites back then who were doing something similar were all quite kind of not very exciting, put it like that.
Yeah, I mean, they would sell stuff that people loved, but it was all very kind of hippy dippy vintage. And I would call myself a punk, maybe still. But at that time, my references were just really different. You know, I was into, you know, this woman, Betty Davis, who has, you know, made incredible funk music. And she was, you know, married to Miles Davis for a while and allegedly like too wild for him. And her lyrics were, you know, really edgy. And so I named Nasty Gal after an album of hers and also a song on that album. But I was like, I'm just going to do it differently. And it could have either been, you know, it could have been like, ew, but it was sticky. And I think, you know, my mom writes a lot and gets paid for it. Later in her career, really started doing that and wrote for the local newspaper. And so I think words have always been really important to me, and naturally just kind of became a copywriter who, you know, the way I wrote things, whether it's the eBay listing or the description of the product or, you know, that week's update, or like my, you know, MySpace profile, what didn't really exist that exists now, and there's agencies that do it all day long, is like a brand that feels like a human, like your friend is talking to you. And what I created with Nasty Gal, I don't know how, was, you know, this kind of world that a woman could see herself kind of stepping into and being like 1 degree ahead of where she was, like slightly cooler, slightly more sophisticated, slightly more stylish, but not to the extent that I'm alienating her. And so, you know, I didn't just dump clothes on a model. I styled it, and she had a handbag and sometimes sunglasses, and she was like, there was movement. She was going somewhere. I wasn't a photographer. I wasn't a trained copywriter. I wasn't a trained merchant. You know, there was none of those things, you know, were anything that I had learned formally, but just, you know, presented it the way I would have wanted to see it. And just kept iterating, right? Like I was not in a place where someone handed me a business like a venture capitalist, and said like, okay, like, here you go, here's some training wheels, like go iterate, but you might run out of money. Like there was no way for me I couldn't run out of money, you know, I didn't have a lot of overhead, but I was like, if I'm going to do this, I have to sell things that people want. And sometimes there were things that I would never wear.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't about my style. You know, I you know, imbued everything with a personality that was very much mine and very much a brand, but it was never like about me, because the whole idea is that you're selling things that people want to buy, and there was no, you know, backstop for me had I tried to do something that people didn't want. Like that's it. You create something that people want and you keep listening, do a better job.
Yeah.
And you find product market fit, which I guess I did. You know?
Yeah. And the name, you know, comes from this very inspiring, empowered punk woman and you know, this kind of, I guess, very cool but ultimately feminist vibe going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something, do you think, which really resonated with the customers, or was it more just, you know, you created something very cool? Or was there an element of like people were buying this stuff because they bought into that philosophy?
Yeah, no, they absolutely bought into it. Like Nasty Gal was a feeling. Like if you bought a motorcycle jacket from Nasty Gal, it was emotional. It was like, this is a promise to my more confident self. It was way more than a jacket. And, you know, if an order was late or we shipped the wrong thing, it was like your best friend had, betrayed you. It was
Wow.
the level of excitement of getting a package from Nasty Gal was, beyond, I think, almost any brand that probably like it was a phenomenon. And that was really cool, and it I think by its own nature, just kind of being there showed people a level of confidence and uniqueness, individuality, permission to be themselves in a way that hadn't existed in the same way, at least online.
Was that a big motivator for you? What was your purpose? Was it that? Was it getting a real kick out of that empowerment? Was it money? What was driving you on to make this happen?
It was money. Not like I wasn't making a ton in the beginning, but it was just like, I cannot work for other people. And it was like, this is fun. Oh my gosh. It was the first time in my life where if I did a better job, the results were better. Like you work in a lobby. I was like, I don't want to be promoted. I don't want to manage people. I don't even know what that means. You work in a record store. It's like, wow, I'm going to be the best clerk in this record store. Like if I did a better job alphabetizing and filing things and putting a whatever sticker on it when it came in, the result wasn't different. So I did kind of bare minimum in the hourly jobs that I had, but it was the first time I'd applied like my like talent or intellect or curiosity in a way where, okay, watch, adapt. Oh my gosh, this auction went higher, or, there's more people bidding on it, or whatever it is. And so that was just really gratifying.
Give
I
us a
think it
sense of
was
how
like,
quickly that happened. How quickly did it give us an idea of some of the numbers and the
yeah,
scale of speed of this thing?
yeah. So the first year, Nasty Gal did, I think, 75K in revenue.
Okay.
And it was just me. But I didn't spend it. I just ate burritos and like Starbucks chai. I didn't want anything. I had like an 87 Volvo and was just spending my time in thrift stores and at estate sales. So I guess I kept the money in the business. And the second year was 250K. The next year was 1.1. Then it was 6.5. And then I think it was like 12 and then 28. I have the original deck that I presented to Index in 2012.
Index Ventures, you became the first venture investor, first outside investor in this business.
Yeah, and so started Nasty Gal probably November, December of 2006. And by 2012, I had raised $50 million on a $350 million post-money valuation.
Wow. And before that happened, the revenue numbers are just surging. At that point, are you feeling like you've won? Are you feeling giddy from the just incredible success of what you've built, which is extraordinary from nothing?
I think so, but I hadn't had a lot of recognition for it. I was just doing my job.
Was it strange to you? Was it kind of, having been checking these ID cards, a very short time later, you're running
Yeah.
this business, which was turning over $28 million?
Yeah, I mean, I was clueless. I started hiring people. I mean, before I had raised money, I had a COO for a little while. I'd hire an HR person. There's no gusto or JustWorks, It was like, everything was very manual and rubbing two sticks together. And, had to hire a guy to process returns and someone to ship things. And I had done all those things. So it made it a lot easier, I think, when I started hiring people, at least for the essential things to get the job done at the time. I was able to train people on my voice and customer service. Hi, of course, not sure. Don't call it sparkly, call it glitter. I don't know, just stuff like that I remember, sitting with people who eventually wrote product descriptions or answered customer service inquiries, or shipped stuff. Like, here's how you slap a label on it. Whatever it was, I had already done it, which made that easy to kind of hand over to other people. I think the styling, photography, editing of the photography, and yeah, that and buying, like curation, was something that I held on to for a long time. Like that was the thing that I was most in the weeds of for the longest time until I hired like a creative director or something. But I think I was really excited about it, but I don't think I had much perspective. And I was like, it was definitely holy shit. I remember in, one holiday season, we were doing in like a day what we were doing, the month a year prior. these are all like kids in their 20s that are, shipping stuff, and we're all doing like, manual, pretty basic work. I remember being like, okay, if we hit these numbers, we're going to get a bounce house and put it in here. And it was like this,
A bouncy castle.
yeah, but it was an upside down horse. So when you jumped in it, the horse legs kind of like moved around and the head like bobbed. It was, I think I might have a photo of it somewhere, but that was, so they'd ship packages and then go jump in the bounce house, and rented it. It
Phenomenal.
wasn't there forever, but that was my idea of like a company park.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It sounds like you were having great fun.
It was really fun. It was the most fun. Yeah. I mean, I got to buy all the vintage. I didn't keep any of it for myself because my job was to sell it.
Yes. Don't get high on your own supply.
Exactly.
What were you most proud of with Nasty Gal?
I think the way it influenced women and their level of confidence. I wasn't like, wow, I'm going to create a feminist brand. But, I think being yourself, which I was being, gives other people permission to be themselves. There was a CMO, who's like the CMO at Patagonia, I think, that said to me a long time ago that the best brands give people permission to be themselves. And a lot of women identified plus with Nasty Gal, and then were like, wow, I could see myself being as cool as that model. Because she's not too pretty. She's pretty, but she's friendly, and she's not like alien luxury kind of, runway model. So there's a lot of things where, I met the customers where they were and then challenged them enough for it to feel aspirational.
I want to come back and talk in depth about the effect on women of both Nasty Gal and Girlboss. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned their index ventures and venture capital. And mm-hmm. so that feels like a kind of couple of crucial moments where they came in, invested at a very high valuation. You were profitable before. Mm-hmm. Then you get kind of flooded with venture capital money. Mm-hmm. And not long afterwards, things take a turn for the worse. I guess they also, I've heard, advised you not to sell the business for $400 million.
Yeah.
So two kind of pivotal moments. You're a venture investor now. I obviously co-founded Giant, a venture firm. So I assume both believe that venture capital can be a real force for good.
Yeah.
But it's not right for every business. And how do you look back at the involvement of venture capital with your business?
I mean, it completely changed the business like overnight. No one had ever set expectations for my business before. I hadn't really set expectations. It was like, yeah, cool, we'll hit this number, but I was just knocking out of the park. I didn't even know how fast it would grow, and I was just trying to keep up with the demand. So it wasn't like, great, we're going to hire 50 people and accelerate growth and invest in this. It was like, oh shit, stuff's selling out. Let me go buy more of it. And it kept selling. It was pretty simple. Just buy things that people want, sell them for more than you paid for them, and don't spend all the money. That's how you build a profitable business. That was literally all I knew. And Index came in, and plowed 50 million into it. I took some money off the table. So the first money in was out of a growth fund.
Okay.
And at that point, it was like I owned 80% of it after I raised $50 million, which was kind of wild. So on paper, I was like worth a lot of money. But again, I don't know. It changed my life.
Yeah.
Very, very materially. I was like 27 or 28. Yeah.
Wow. And on paper at that point, you're worth like $300 million.
Like 280 or something.
Yeah.
And then, the expectation, I brought in like a whole suite of C-level executives and a chief people officer and a CTO. Like there was no Shopify. Like we had to build our e-com site in like Cold Fusion. I'm not an engineer, but it was like at that time it was even like ancient technology. Had to have a whole product team to just build a regular shopping app. So it became a really expensive enterprise. And, I remember sitting at a table with Danny Reimer and the COO I had hired at the time. And it was like, okay, we're doing 28 million this year. I don't know if it was 6 or 12 it could have been more. The deck I looked at that I presented them was actually, the growth was bigger than feel like I've been saying on podcasts for a long time. It's just like all such a blur.
Yeah.
And so we rounded up by 100 million. I was like, these are like grown-ups that have built business, Danny hadn't built a business, but he's seen, the, insides of enough businesses to where I was like, okay, these people know what they're doing. And, of course he does. And
He was your investor at
yeah, he
with
was my
Index, right?
investor.
Yeah.
I had one board member.
Okay.
I had 2 seats and he had one, and the other one of my seats was empty.
Okay.
Almost until the end,
Yeah.
which wasn't a good choice.
Okay.
But we sat there and rounded up by 100 million. And then
Your forecast?
yeah,
Okay.
that was it, like based on, I don't know, explosive growth. And then it was like, okay, well, to do that, we need to hire, I don't know, 100 people. And I was really ill-equipped to hire 100 people.
Right.
And, to build processes. And, it just became this kind of like, Tower of Babel cluster of, people showing up and, duplication of efforts and people bumping into one another. And it was just not something I was like able to manage. It was a really good recruiter and everybody wanted to work for Nasty Gal.
I can imagine, yeah.
But it was a major step change. And that's usually a good word.
Right.
In the business and the expectations of me as like a CEO and a leader, and I have to get up and inspire people. Like, I'm an introvert. Like, I have a personality, but it's not my nature to get up and like rah.
Yes.
Like, I cannot put on a smile unless I actually think something is funny.
Yeah.
So I had no idea what leadership was. Like, I kind of understood management, but people needed to be told what to do, inspired to do it, and then told what to do, even C-level executives. And then I had to make sure that they actually were doing it. And I was like, I'm sorry. These people have had careers for longer than I've been alive, some of them, 25-year veterans, whatever. And I thought they'd show up and diagnose the business and all work together and, figure out a plan and, grow the thing because they had, built other companies and built teams before. And that wasn't necessarily the case. I didn't always check in and make, okay, well, you said this is going to be 2 months. And it's like, this person's paid like a few $100,000 a year. Just do what you say you're going to do. I show up and do what I say I'm going to do. I do what I think the business needs, and I don't have any other choice. But I had never, been an employee, and I had no example of what leadership looked like. So I had absolutely no, I guess I want to say empathy's tough. Like, I can't say I didn't have empathy. I don't know what the word is, but I had no playbook for what my job had very quickly become.
Did you feel at the time like you were losing control?
No, which is probably the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really see under the hood until later on.
How do you look back now at the decision not to sell the business for $400 million and the advice you got around that?
Urban Outfitters isn't historically acquisitive.
Okay.
And I think whatever the deal would have been, I think integrating the company into their, family business really, would have been really challenging. And 99% of deals just don't get done anyway.
Okay.
So I don't want to be like, wow, 100% that would have happened and God, I regret it so much. It's an example of me taking advice from people who I would say are greedier than I am and have LPs to answer to and would rather lose the money than mark it down or just hold it at cost. Like, I didn't know they had bosses.
Yeah.
And they had to go put on a, annual kind of AGM
Right.
for their investors and be like, rah, look, if they had to mark Nasty Gal down or sell it at cost, it wouldn't have looked good, but holding it at cost's not so bad. And so, I didn't know for a long time that, as much as supportive as my investors were, our interests just were not aligned. And that's something that is, I think, a important thing to talk about, an important thing for founders to understand, because I learned that the hard way. And like I said, I didn't have a board because I had heard from other people that boards are just pissing contests and people disagreeing and people having egos. And so I was like, I don't want to deal with that. But had I had other voices around the table, advisors, other investors, because I raised from Index and Thrive. I think Thrive put in $1 million.
Okay.
It's like Josh Kushner and Will Gabrick with like crackly voices. They were like kids. I was like, who gave you this money? This is crazy. And had I had more like former operators around, or maybe had I raised money from a former operator, I think it would have been really different.
Agreed. So 2016, you've built this incredible business. It's starting to go perhaps a little bit wrong, but the outside world doesn't know that. You've written this incredible best-selling book, Girlboss, which has been then turned into a Netflix show. The show has been shot. You're the hero of the show. And just before it comes out, things start to really fall apart in the business. Tell us about that year and what it was like living through it.
Yeah. So 2016, I would say, is the hardest year of my life. We had some layoffs in 2015. It was not the best. I wrote the book it was published at the beginning of 2014.
Right.
So it's been 11 years, which is wild. And, we had some layoffs in 2015, opened a couple stores, tried to go offline. And at the beginning of I'd hired a CEO for the last 2 years. I was like, I don't like this job. I want to do the creative stuff. So I had moved into, just the chairman role, but was still very involved. At the same time, the success of the book was something that was just like a runaway success. And Girlboss, the book, the philosophy, the word, the hashtag, the movement that people called it, was almost louder than Nasty Gal, which was like the business that I had built to over 100 million in revenue, by the way. I think that's probably important to mention. And eventually kind of ran out of it. But it became harder to fund the business because, like I said, similar to the acquisition offer I'd gotten, it was in my investors' best interest not to, take a haircut or do a down round and just say like, all right, figure it out. We, took on some venture debt and just kind of kicked something that didn't have to be inevitable, but the inevitable down the road. Is that what you say?
Right.
Colloquialisms are different here. So I'm going to start, like my American colloquialisms are going to start atrophying.
We'll train
I'm
you
going to
up,
say
don't
things
worry.
like, I can't be arsed. Like, what?
You've only been here a month. You're a quick learner.
I know. I'm dating an Englishman, so there's that.
Ah, very good.
And so things were already tough. There had been headlines about toxic culture. We'd had layoffs.
Was there toxic culture?
Probably. I don't think I was toxic. I think I didn't give people a chance. So I would just like fire them and be like, that's not okay. You should know better.
Okay.
So I think I would have been a better leader had I helped people like get there or given them opportunities to improve. But I would have had to know what they don't know to do that, and I didn't know what they needed to do to,
Right.
To a certain extent.
Yes.
So, that's hard, but every founder experiences that. I just think some founders are probably better than others at it. And yeah, I mean, you lay off the PR team and it's their job to yap.
Right.
So not that I don't take responsibility for, everything that happened in the company. The fact is that the CEO knows 10% of what's happening in their company.
Sure.
There's just, I don't know what boss is being a dick to some junior employee. I don't know who's saying weird shit.
Yeah.
And people in a room saying things like, that's not on brand. And, other employers like feel bad about themselves. And there's like, it was a fashion company and I wasn't cliquey, but, people working at Nasty Gal was very cool.
Right.
And, there were people who thought very highly of themselves because they were there and they were in positions of power. And, I think that can just get really ugly. It's the companies that people have a lot of affinity for that you see in the headlines when things don't go right. It's there where, there's this schism between the utopia the employees think that, they've signed on for because, they're working at this cool company, but actually it's like any other company and you can only employ people when there's the business to support it. But it was similar to a customer getting, an order late and being like, oh my God, it was like a personal assault on somebody who was removed from the company because, they identified so much with being a part of Nasty Gal and the culture, which is what you want, but it's also, if you get fired from Verizon, or I don't know, Thames Water, like I don't think you're gonna be like, oh my God, I'm not part of this thing that, when I went out to a bar and I said I worked at Nasty Gal, people thought I was cooler. Like, so laid people off, whatever, not whatever. But in 2016, I'd gotten married in 2015
Okay.
to someone I had dated for like 4 years before that and actually met when I was 19. And by 2016, I think June of 2016, I was on the cover of Forbes. They said I was richer than Beyonce on paper. And by July, my husband of like a year-ish was like, see ya. And I was like, what? Like, he didn't even like argue. Can you at least argue before we get there? It was just like, a big surprise. And I had a solid prenup, so whatever. He got like 50 grand in a Volvo. Loser. He didn't work for like like 3 years, he had like my credit card. It's like, whatever. I was like, I'm a generous person. I'm just like, if it was like some dude that had made a bunch of money and his girlfriend was working for 50 grand a year, he'd probably just be like, listen, like, I don't even get to see you because you're grinding away at this job. So maybe that would have been normal, and I tried to just do what seemed normal, like we're building a life together kind of thing. But I don't know how that works the other way around. Anyway, so by July, he had like bounced. By November, Nasty Gal had filed for Chapter 11.
Okay.
And so it was a series of potential acquisitions. We did do a down round. Ron Johnson from like Apple, JCPenney came in and, tried to fix things and brought his cronies in and, was like, we're going to, have this strategic acquisition. And I just remember walking up to, I don't know, it was like one of his guys and saying, what's the chance this happens? And his answer was 100%. And that's where I was just like, oh, fuck. Like, I know that's not, like, if you don't know that is very unlikely to be true, then I'm really scared for the future. And at that point, I was just so far in over my head. To a certain extent, I had checked out. And we could have recapitalized the business, after bankruptcy. We could have, like, started again. But I was like, I did this for 10 years. I'm not going to start the thing I already started. And it was like the first point where I was like, I'm going to be selfish about this. And when we did file for Chapter 11, it was like, I have to say, like a little bit of a relief, because when you raise $50 million, it's really hard to quit. And it's with a brand like Nasty Gal, it's really hard to be fired. So I was like, oh my God, I'm out. It was devastating, but it was also like a big exhale at the same time.
And at the same time as all this is happening, you are literally all over the world on Netflix. Or
Yep.
your character is.
Yeah.
You're the hero of this show.
November, the company files for Chapter 11 while this show's being made called Girlboss, about who I was when I was 22 years old, starting an eBay store in San Francisco. 5 months later, I think in April of 2017, Netflix, releases a show called Girlboss, streams it into 130 million homes in 195 countries in almost every language. And this was 4 months after, Trump had just been elected. Hillary had lost. Like, the whole conversation around women had totally changed. Things became way more political. And it was just like a goofy kind of scripted comedy. But it was, like, why do we need to be called girl bosses? I'm just a boss. It just was like, it was just the name of a book. Like, it and the timing was just bad, because then I was like, I tanked a company. Maybe I wasn't the girl boss. I was a fraud. And there were headlines like, does the failure of Nasty Gal mean millennials aren't ready to lead? And I was like, oh my God, like, the public sees me as the example of millennial leadership. I didn't even know that was the case. And so it was really devastating. The hardest part was when the Netflix series came out, because there's this the public just really conflated the character, what happened on the show. She was kind of abrasive, things, they wrote stuff into the show that like didn't actually happen. I thought it was like kind of a cute show, like outside of depicting me. I didn't have influence over the script or how I was depicted. I was like, here's some vintage, don't make her look lame, and get that band poster off the wall in her bedroom. That was the extent of my influence. And so there's this like huge conflation between like Sophia the leader, the girl boss that we loved, like someone responsible for a lot of employees and a lot of, money, and this character that, had been totally made up. And it's like, which one of those is she? And so it wasn't really any of that. I wasn't any of them, because I'm a complex person that's like nobody no stranger who writes something about me could ever know. So that was really, really hard.
Were you treated differently as a female founder who failed compared to how a man would be treated?
Yeah.
In what way?
I mean, there's just no, if you look at the history, of women, there's so few of us leading. And if you look at just like across the board institutionally, like the disparity like between men and women historically, and like we've just kind of always been way behind, and also in the workplace. And so there's few of us, and there's few of us to point to. And I was the example, the poster child of female millennial leadership. And so my megaphone was big. There was a lot more eyes on me. But I think in most areas of life, and the way people are perceived and women are treated, it's all very much based on other people's perception of our identity, whether that's your religion or your gender or your color. It's like you're walking into the room with some privilege, there's, I think there's a whole whatever intersectionality and ranking of those things, but there's no way that I couldn't have been, because that's just the way the world works. It's not even like specific to business.
There was a lot of over intellectualization about Girlboss, right? So it was like, well, it shouldn't be. People said it should be women boss, not girl boss, right? Why they call girls, not women. People said there shouldn't be, as you said, there shouldn't be girl boss, it should just be boss. And yeah, lots of intellectualizing about it. How do you feel about some of that criticism?
It was a pink book. It was a pink book that was like, go get him. I was in my 20s. It was a book that was simple. Some of it was maybe even like naive. I had written it when everything was going great. So, I think it would have been different had I experienced more adversity in the business before I wrote it. But the book had kicked off, this amazing, I'm a girl boss, right? I built 2 businesses where people said, I'm a nasty gal and I'm a girl boss. Like, I don't think it gets any higher as far as the brand goes to have people actually start, put I am in front of the name of your brand, right?
Amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. I think it became this, it entered the zeitgeist in a way that was completely out of my control. And again, you can only hope that the things you create have that kind of impact. But at a certain point, it no longer became mine. And people kind of used it as a shorthand for, sometimes really great, like, I'm a girl boss. And then sometimes like, oh, girl boss is kind of this oversimplification of female capitalism and whatever. And it's just like, I don't know, I wrote a pink book, and, that was my experience, and why am I responsible for all women? And, people were, asking me to talk about the wage gap. And it's like, I don't know, I never experienced that because I never like had a job in an office. It was weird, but also it was just no longer mine in a way that is really cool, that what you create becomes this, again, shorthand for something, even if it's politicized or over intellectualized, that, people can use to have an important conversation. And I do think there are a lot of important conversations that where the word girl boss was used. But I also think people are really giddy about taking down women. And I think that was part of it, where it was like, and there's the 2020 kind of like slaughter of every female founder. And I don't know if you like were witness to that, but
Yes.
that was like the end of the girl boss is a good thing. Like there's, just so many headlines, and it's
Yeah.
like Glossier is toxic, and Away is
Away.
toxic,
Yeah.
and the founders of Refinery 29 are awful, and the founder of Reformation's racist, and it's like the wing completely went under, right? A women's co-working space. And so I think, like I said, people work for companies. If a company stands for something, they expect the company to cure things that exist everywhere and permeate all parts of society. Just because a woman founds a brand and tries to do good for women doesn't mean that things that, exist everywhere aren't going to sneak into the company and affect the employees. But there's like this expectation that it's going to be this place that just, heals all disparity, and everyone's going to have like a great experience, and those kinds of things aren't going to exist. And I think when you stand for something, and I don't know if this has happened with you, because you make, you invest in impact focused businesses, there will be people who say like, well, that's not good. EVs have batteries that are bad, or whatever. People will poke holes in anything you try to do that's good. And I think that was like that's a big part of why that happened.
Talking about female founders, do I have a responsibility to proactively go out there and try to back as many strong female founders as possible? Or is it more about just making sure the process is fair and not trying to, impact the number of women who come through the door? How do you feel about that in terms of our responsibility as investors?
I think it's a nuanced like question or answer, because I see less female founded companies. There are less of them. There's also less second time female founders. So if 5 or 10 years ago, there were way less female founders. Like the guys who built those companies have built shops that, as someone who's going to give someone money to build a business, something that makes you feel more comfortable sometimes. Doesn't always mean that they're great at what they did, and maybe they failed, but they have some experience. That's something I like second time founders, because I did so much, I was such a better leader in my second company. I was a clueless first time founder. I also see a lot of female founded business that are consumer businesses, and I don't invest in consumer. So that makes it harder. It feels like there's a lot more women who want to start brands, and, my background is in consumer and brands, but that's not what I want to spend the second half of my career doing, because I blew it in the first half of my career. And I also don't think that most consumer businesses are venture backable or can have venture-sized outcomes. Yes, I have responsibility. I could do a better job. Like if you look at my portfolio, there aren't enough female founders. And I think that's just by the nature of like the deals I've seen and what I've found conviction for. And it's my job as someone who's investing other people's money to optimize for that, over, I think, giving people a shot. It's not angel money, like it's venture money. And I have bosses, and my job is ultimately to make money for them.
We've backed at least one company together.
Yeah.
Tell me and the listeners about what you look for in entrepreneurs now that you are a venture investor.
I look for founders that have domain expertise, who have, spent time in companies that are solving similar problems or problems that are parallel in some way, or founders who have experienced the problem that they are trying to solve personally, and have, again, like empathy for the end user, and just understand the problem on a cellular level. I like second-time founders. I like founders who aren't egotistical. Like, you get on the phone with some of these really confident guys, and sometimes they like build companies, but it's just the way they talk is sometimes so entitled and just like cringy. It doesn't happen a lot, but I definitely avoid the people that seem overconfident. I think being a zealot is different than being overconfident.
Yes.
So I want to hire zealots who are like committed to building the thing, who I think can lead and get people behind them. You know, if you're investing money in a founder, you also need to know that they're going to be able to go raise subsequent rounds, or ideally maybe they, you know, become profitable. But if they do want to, or raise subsequent rounds, there has to be some talent that they can go pitch people and raise money. You know, so I also have to believe that they can keep doing other things as a founder that aren't in relation to the product they're building, or aren't even in relation to leadership. Like, that's a whole nother part of what comes with building a venture-backed business.
We could go on forever, but we have time for one more question,
Okay.
which is we ask all of our guests this. What is it about you that has created all of the enormous success, which we just talked about?
I think it's that I'm a really curious person, and I thrive in environments that I don't technically belong in. And I found a way to make imposter syndrome something that works in my favor, because when I hear or feel that I don't belong, it actually means that I'm just doing something different and I have a different perspective, and I'm brave enough to bring that to the table, and it tends to cut through the noise. So I think for anybody who's, you know, afraid to do that, it's important to know that that can also be your superpower. And it's not that hard. You just be yourself. It's like, I'm just lazy.
Very powerful. Sophia, thank you so much for sharing your giant idea.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. If you like the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the show. And you can find many more giant ideas wherever you get your podcasts.